Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take dense source material and, well, make it manageable, giving you the core knowledge you really need.
And today, we're tackling a big one. Assessment of the renal and urinary system. It's fundamental.
Absolutely. Our source is packed with info anatomy, physiology, assessment cues. It's a lot.
It is. So our goal today is pretty straightforward. Give you a clear, high-yield summary. We're focusing on what you need to spot kidney problems and, keep patients safe.
We're really digging into how the kidneys manage elimination, fluid balance, and acid-base balance. Our source highlights elimination as the priority concept here.
Yeah, but elimination is just what you see on the surface, isn't it? It's completely tied into fluid and electrolyte balance and atom-base balance. Those are the three pillars the kidneys hold up.
And if the kidneys falter,
then all three of those pillars start to wobble or even collapse. That's why getting this assessment right is so critical. It has systemic implications.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the functional unit, or maybe even bigger picture first, the location.
Sure. So the kidneys, they're tucked back there, retroperitoneal. But what's really striking is their blood flow. We're talking 600 to 1,300 milliliters every single minute.
Wow, that much blood constantly flowing through.
Exactly. And that tells you right away why they're so vulnerable. If someone's in shock or severely dehydrated, that blood pressure drops.
And the kidneys feel it immediately because they need that constant high-volume flow.
Precisely. And size gives us clues too, right? The source mentions normal size is about 4 to 5 inches.
Yeah, and if they're bigger, could be an obstruction, maybe polycystic kidney disease.
Could be. Or if they're smaller, you'd suspect chronic kidney disease, CKD. It's a quick visual cue during imaging.
Okay, so zooming in now, down to the microscopic level, the nephron.
The workhorse. About 1 million per kidney. These tiny units do all the heavy lifting.
And it's interesting, our source points out there are actually two types.
That's right. You've got your cortical nephrons, the majority. But then there are the juxtamedullary nephrons, only about 20%, but they're specialized.
Specialized how?
Their loops of Henle dip way down deep into the medulla. This structure is essential for concentrating urine. So when you're dehydrated, these guys kick into high gear to help you conserve water.
Ah, okay. And this concentrating ability, it's the end result of the three big processes of urine formation, starting with filtration.
Right. Glomerular filtration. Think of the glomerulus like a very selective sieve. Normally, big things like blood cells, platelets, large proteins like albumin, they don't get through.
So if you do see albumin or blood cells in the urine,
that's a major red flag. It means that filtering membrane, the glomerulus, is damaged. Something's wrong.
And the sheer volume filtered is mind-blowing. The normal glomerular filtration rate, or GFR, is about 125 milliliter per minute.
Yeah, which adds up to something like 180 liters of filtrate every single day. It's incredible.
But obviously, we don't pee out 180 liters.
No, definitely not. We typically excrete only 1 to 3 liters. The reason is the second phase, tubular reabsorption.
This is where the body pulls back what it needs.
Exactly. About 99% of that water, electrolytes, glucose, all the good stuff gets reabsorbed back into the blood almost immediately after being filtered.
And there's fine-tuning involved, especially with water, regulated by hormones in the later parts of the tubule.
Right, primarily in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting ducts. This is where vasopressin, or ADH, comes in. It makes those tubules permeable to water, allowing it to be reabsorbed.
And aldosterone.
Aldosterone works on sodium reabsorption, and the classic nursing mantra holds true. Where sodium goes, water follows. So these hormones let the body precisely manage its fluid balance.
Now, speaking of reabsorption, glucose. The kidneys grab all of it back, but only up to a certain point.
Correct. There's a limit known as the renal threshold for glucose. If your blood glucose level shoots above about 180 milligrams per deciliter.
The tubules just get overwhelmed.
They do. They can't reabsorb it all. And the excess glucose spills out into the urine. Glycosuria. It's a hallmark sign of uncontrolled diabetes.
Okay, so filtration, reabsorption. What's the third step?
Tubular secretion. This is the opposite of reabsorption. Here, the tubules actively move substances from the blood into the filtrate to be excreted.
Like what kind of substances?
Things like potassium, K+, and very importantly, hydrogen ions, H+ blethgide. This secretion is crucial for getting rid of excess acid and maintaining the body's pH balance. It's the kidney's way of fine-tuning acid base when the lungs can't compensate enough.
So the kidney isn't just filtering, it's actively managing electrolytes and pH. And it doesn't stop there. It also acts like an endocrine organ, right? Producing hormones.
Absolutely critical function. When blood pressure, blood volume, or even sodium levels drop, the kidney releases renin.
Which kicks off that whole RAAS cascade renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system.
Exactly. Leads to vasoconstriction, aldosterone release, ultimately raising blood pressure. Then there's erythropoietin, or EPO.
For red blood cell production.
Right. The kidney releases EPO when it senses low oxygen levels. So if the kidney is failing...
EPO production drops and the patient becomes anemic.
Precisely. So unexplained anemia in someone with risk factors. You have to think kidney function. It's not just a blood issue. It's often a kidney hormone issue.
And the third hormone, vitamin D activation.
Yes. The kidney performs the final step to activate vitamin D, which you need to absorb calcium from your gut. So kidney failure also leads to problems with calcium balance and bone health.
Seeing anemia and bone problems together really points towards the kidneys then.
It definitely should raise your suspicion. It shows how kidney health impacts the whole body.
Okay, that's a great foundation. Let's shift gears now to assessment recognizing cues and risk factors. This is where it gets really interesting, starting with things we can't change.
Age is the big one. GFR naturally declines as we get older. The source mentions by age 65, it might be down around 65 millimin.
And that has consequences.
Huge consequences. Increased risk for fluid overload, for sure. More urinary urgency, sometimes nocturnal polyuria, having to get up multiple times at night to pee.
But the really big safety concern.
Drug clearance. That lower GFR means many common drugs hang around longer, increasing the risk of toxicity. Medication management in older adults needs careful attention to kidney function.
The source also points out a disparity related to race.
Yes, it notes that African Americans tend to have a faster age-related decline in GFR and are at a higher risk for kidney failure.
Which means proactive screening is key.
Absolutely. Yearly checks for microalbuminuria, tiny amounts of protein in the urine, an early sign of damage, and serum creatinine are really important for this population.
And gender plays a role too.
Just anatomically. Women have a shorter urethra, which makes them more prone to bladder infections or cystitis.
Okay, those are non-modifiable. What about the risks we could potentially influence? History taking is key here.
Definitely. Two chronic conditions stand out as major threats to kidney health: diabetes and hypertension.
Because they damage the small blood vessels in the kidneys over time.
Exactly. They wreck the microvasculature within the nephrons. So managing blood sugar and blood pressure is kidney protection.
We also need to ask about exposures, right? Things that are directly toxic to the kidneys.
Yes, nephrotoxins. Think certain antibiotics, heavy metals like lead or mercury, some industrial solvents, but also really common things.
Oh,
High doses or long-term use of NSAIDs, ibuprofen, naproxen, and even acetaminophen can damage kidneys over time. And a huge one in the hospital setting is iodinated contrast media used for CT scans and other imaging.
We'll definitely come back to contrast safety. Let's talk about what the patient might tell us symptoms. What about pain? How do we recognize kidney pain?
You need to listen for descriptions of renal colic. This isn't just a dull ache. It's typically severe, sharp, comes in waves, spasmodic, often starts in the flank area.
And stays there.
No, that's the key. It often radiates down towards the groin, the perineum, into the labia or scrotum. It can be so intense it causes nausea, vomiting, pallor, sweating, even hypotension. It's usually caused by a stone trying to pass.
Sounds unbearable. What about less dramatic, more systemic symptoms, the ones that creep up when waste products build up?
Ah, you're talking about uremia. That's the buildup of nitrogenous wastes in the blood because the kidneys aren't clearing them.
And how does that manifest?
It's often insidious: loss of appetite or anorexia, nausea, sometimes vomiting, feeling profoundly tired, fatigued, and one really distressing symptom can be pretty severe generalized itching because those waste products get deposited in the skin.
So that cluster of symptoms, anorexia, nausea, fatigue, itching, should make you think the kidneys aren't filtering properly.
Definitely. It signals a significant level of kidney dysfunction.
Okay, let's move to the objective data, the diagnostic assessments. Lab work first.
Blood tests are crucial, and the #1 indicator of kidney function is serum creatinine.
Why creatinine?
Because it's a waste product of muscle metabolism, produced at a fairly constant rate and almost exclusively filtered out by the kidneys. So if creatinine levels in the blood rise, it directly reflects a decrease in kidney filtering ability.
And there's a critical safety threshold mentioned in our source.
Yes. A serum creatinine level of 1.5 mg/dL or greater is a major warning sign. It signals significant kidney impairment and puts the patient at high risk for acute kidney injury, or AKI, especially if they're exposed to something like contrast dye.
That's a number everyone needs to know.
Yeah.
1.5 or higher is a flag.
Absolutely. And another rule of thumb, if a patient's baseline creatinine level doubles, it generally means their GFR has been cut in half, a 50% reduction in kidney function.
Wow. Okay. What about BUN, blood urea nitrogen?
BUN is looked at too, but it's less specific than creatinine.
Why is that?
Because BUN levels can be affected by lots of things besides kidney function, like your hydration status, how much protein you're eating, tissue breakdown, even GI bleeding.
So high BUN doesn't automatically mean kidney failure.
Not necessarily. That's why we often look at the BUN creatinine ratio. If BUN is way up but creatinine is normal or only slightly elevated, it might suggest dehydration or maybe decreased blood flow to the kidneys rather than intrinsic kidney damage. If both BUN and creatinine are rising together, then you're more suspicious of actual kidney dysfunction.
Makes sense. The source also briefly mentions cystatin C, as it might be a better indicator.
Yeah, it's a newer marker. The potential advantage is that cystatin C is produced by most cells at a constant rate and isn't affected by muscle mass, unlike creatinine.
So it could be more accurate in people with very high or very low muscle mass.
Potentially, yes. It might give more reliable estimate of GFR in those cases. It's something to keep an eye on as it becomes more widely used.
Okay, let's move from blood to urine. The urinalysis, or UA. Can you walk us through the key things we'd look for, like describing the table in the source?
Sure. First, you look at the basics. Specific gravity tells you about concentration. Normal is roughly 1.005 to 1.030. Higher means more concentrated, like dehydration. Lower means more dilute.
And pH,
Normal urine pH is slightly acidic, averaging around 6.0, but the range is pretty wide, like 4.6 to 8.0. Now, the abnormal findings are really telling.
like protein.
Exactly. Finding significant proteinuria is a big deal. Normally, very little protein gets through the glomerulus. If it's there, it points to glomerular damage. Diabetes, hypertension, glomerular diseases.
What about ketones?
Ketones in the urine mean the body is breaking down fat for energy instead of glucose. You see this in uncontrolled diabetes, starvation, sometimes low-carb diets.
And microalbuminuria, you mentioned that earlier.
Right. This is detecting very small amounts of albumin. It's often the earliest sign of kidney damage, especially in people with diabetes. It's a crucial screening test.
And findings that suggest infection.
You look for leukocyte esterase, which is an enzyme released by white blood cells, and nitrates. Many common UTI bacteria convert nitrates to nitrates. So if either or both are positive, it strongly suggests a urinary tract infection.
Good rundown. There's also a critical safety point about handling the urine specimen itself.
Oh, absolutely crucial. That sample needs to get to the lab fast, ideally within 1 hour.
Why so urgent?
Because if urine sits around at room temperature, bacteria multiply, pH increases, becomes more alkaline, red and white blood cells can break down, casts can disintegrate. Basically, the results become unreliable. You can miss important clues.
So prompt delivery is non-negotiable for an accurate UA.
Correct. Don't collect it and let it sit on the counter for hours.
Now, sometimes a simple UA isn't enough. What about the 24-hour composite urine collection?
Ah, the 24-hour urine. This is used when we need a precise measurement of something the kidneys excrete over a full day, like creatinine clearance, total protein, hormones, etc.
And the instructions for this are strict, aren't they?
Extremely strict. The key rule is every single drop of urine produced during that 24-hour period must be collected. The process usually starts after the patient voids and discards the first morning specimen. Then, all urine for the next 24 hours goes into a special container, often kept refrigerated or on ice.
What happens if the patient forgets and voids in the toilet once?
The entire collection is ruined. You have to stop, discard what you have, and start the whole 24-hour process over again the next day. Communication and patient education are paramount for this test.
Okay, labs covered. Let's shift to imaging and procedures that let us actually see the urinary system.
Right. We have some non-invasive options first. A KUB is just a plain abdominal X-ray kidneys, ureters, bladder. It can show gross abnormalities, calcifications like stones.
Simple enough. Then ultrasonography.
Ultrasound is great. Uses sound waves, no radiation. It's excellent for looking at kidney size, shape, detecting masses, cysts, hydronephrosis, swelling due to blockage, and stones. Often the patient needs a full bladder for better visualization, and using Doppler with it lets us assess blood flow to the kidneys.
And the renal scan.
This involves injecting a small amount of a radioactive isotope. It shows kidney blood flow, structure, and function, how well the kidneys take up and excrete the isotope. It's a good alternative if a patient can't have iodinated contrast, maybe due to allergy or poor kidney function.
Okay, speaking of contrast, This is where safety becomes paramount. Let's talk CT scans with contrast.
Huge safety considerations here. Iodinated contrast dye can be nephrotoxic itself, causing contrast-induced nephropathy, especially in patients who already have CKD, diabetes, dehydration, or heart failure. We need to know their baseline kidney function before injecting contrast.
And there's one medication interaction that is an absolute MST check.
Metformin, the oral diabetes medication. Combining metformin with 5-E contrast dye dramatically increases the risk of lactic acidosis, which can be fatal.
So what's the protocol?
Metformin must be held. Typically, it's stopped at least 24 hours before the procedure involving contrast and held for at least 48 hours afterward. It shouldn't be restarted until kidney function has been reevaluated and confirmed to be stable. This is a critical safety checkpoint. No exceptions.
Cannot emphasize that enough. What about MRI? Sometimes that uses contrast too.
Yes, MRI often uses gadolinium-based contrast agents. The risk here, particularly in patients with reduced kidney function, is nephrogenic systemic fibrosis, NSF.
What is NSF?
It's a rare but devastating condition causing thickening and hardening of the skin, joints, muscles, and even internal organs. Because of this risk, gadolinium contrast is generally avoided if the patient's serum creatinine is above 1.5 mg/dL or their estimated GFR is below 45 mWin. Always check kidney function before gadolinium.
Okay, crucial safety points for contrast.
Okay.
Now for the invasive procedures. Cystoscopy.
This involves inserting a scope through the urethra to directly visualize the bladder lining and the urethra. It's used for diagnosis, sometimes treatment like removing small stones or tumors or taking biopsies.
What are the post-procedure priorities?
Monitoring. We need to watch for complications like bleeding. Some pink-tinged urine is normal initially, but bright red bleeding or clots are not. Also watch for signs of bladder perforation, abdominal pain, rigidity, or infection, fever, cloudy urine. Encourage fluids to help flush the bladder.
And probably the most invasive diagnostic test. Kidney biopsy?
Yes, usually done percutaneously, meaning a needle through the skin into the kidney to get a tissue sample. It gives definitive diagnostic information for certain kidney diseases.
But it comes with significant risk.
The major risk, hands down, is bleeding. The kidneys are highly vascular. Poking a needle into one carries a real risk of causing internal bleeding or a hematoma.
So post-biopsy care is all about monitoring for that bleeding.
Absolutely. You're watching vital signs closely, especially blood pressure. A drop could mean internal bleeding. Assess the flank site for swelling or bruising. Monitor urine output. Decreased output could signal a clot or bleed, compressing things. Look for flank pain.
And activity restrictions.
Strict bed rest is usually required immediately after, typically lying flat supine for anywhere from 2 to 6 hours, sometimes longer, depending on protocol. This pressure helps tamponade the biopsy site and reduce bleeding risk. That bed rest period is not optional. It's vital for safety.
Wow, okay. We've covered a tremendous amount, from the microscopic nephron all the way to managing high-risk procedures. Let's try to boil it down. Key takeaways for you, the listener.
I'd say first, remember the kidney isn't just a filter. Think about those hormonal roles if you see unexplained anemia or bone issues. Think kidneys. Second, burn that number into your brain. Serum creatinine greater than 1.5 mg/dL is your critical safety alert level.
That's hard.
Master the safety protocols around contrast media, especially the metformin hold for iodinated contrast and checking GFR before giving gadolinium for MRI. These are non-negotiable patient safety actions. And maybe if we connect this to the bigger picture, assessing the renal system really forces you to think critically. It's not just about one lab value or one symptom. It's about seeing the connections, how systemic diseases like diabetes and hypertension impact this intricate filtering system, the nephron.
And understanding these assessment points helps distinguish what?
It helps you distinguish between something relatively simple, like maybe dehydration affecting BUN, versus true progressive kidney damage that's going to impact every other body system. It's about seeing the whole picture through the lens of kidney function.
That's a great way to frame it. Thank you. This has been incredibly insightful, really walking us through the essentials of renal assessment based on our source.
Glad to do it. It's complex, but so important.
And thank you all for tuning in to The Deep Dive. We'll catch you on the next one.